Welcome to Revisiting the Vault, a podcast where we're exploring the history of film, animation, fashion, music, and pretty much everything, but through a Disney lens. This time, it's the first half of our discussion of Pinocchio from 1940. I am Mary Ratliff. I am your resident film nerd. I am a writer and a social media coordinator.
And I am Gretchen Harwell. I'm sorry, I thought there was something else coming there.
No, you know what? I kind of left it on an up note like there was.
So, I am Gretchen Harwell. I am your resident fashion history nerd, animal nerd. Got a lot of thoughts about the animals in this movie. And I am a mom, and so I am living in Disney culture these days.
This podcast and this project, we're watching all of the Disney animated features in chronological order of their theatrical release, which means that our next one is Pinocchio, originally released February 23rd, 1940, which was 3 years after Snow White. Feels like a long time to us now, but actually was pretty short turnaround for animated films back then.
Yes, but I will say, a lot happened in those 3 years.
When you think of like world history, like 1937 to 1940,
right.
that's a heavy hitting set of 3 years.
A lot of Disney film animation evolution happened in those 3 years to boot. So we'll get to that.
Yeah, definitely. They did intend to do Bambi next instead of Pinocchio, but they wanted Bambi to actually look realistic, and they were having trouble doing that. So they were like, let's go back to the puppets and the fantasy stuff. I think that was a good choice.
Yep.
It clearly paid off for them, because when we get to Bambi, that animation is astonishing. But, as we mentioned, 1940, kind of an important year.
Right. Things happened.
Many things happened.
Yep.
We were smack in the middle of World War II. So Pinocchio was a commercial flop. One of the reasons that they were having trouble with the animation was a lot of their animators got drafted or were joining the military. They released this in a time where most of Europe was not having movies, not screening stuff.
Nope.
And so no international returns whatsoever. So they did not make their money back at all. I can't remember if they made it back in the first re-release or the second, but it took a very long time for Pinocchio, the film itself, to be considered commercially successful.
Right.
Critically, though, everybody loved it. The critics loved it, and I think for good reason. Roger Ebert, when he wrote about it in his list of great movies, he said that Pinocchio isn't just a concocted fable or a silly fairy tale, but a narrative with deep archetypal reverberations. I include this quote because I think that is, as Roger Ebert often is, very spot on.
Yes.
There's also a contemporaneous review from the Hollywood Reporter that talked about how this picture is infinitely superior to Snow White from a technical standpoint, but also they mention a few other things, but the technical standpoint for conception and production, that is so true.
Yes.
You can see so much evolution just in the actual ability to animate.
Right. And I will say, just as a non-film nerd viewer, even though I have some major issues with this movie, I still like it a lot better than Snow White because it's just kind of easier on the eyes. I don't know a better way to put it than that. Snow White is kind of, by comparison, jittery. This movie's a lot smoother. There's just, the colors are brighter. The payoff is better. The people have faces and noses. It is easier to watch on so many levels. Still kind of terrible to watch, but at the same time, we'll get there.
It has a lot of things that detract from it, for sure. But at the same time, and this was sort of part of why I wanted to do this project as a chronological look, is because I wanted to actually see the animation technique and how it evolved. I didn't expect the first two movies to give me such a distinct, exact leap like they do.
Yes, and as a technological achievement, it is bam.
Right. They don't do any rotoscoping for the human movements, but they did do a lot of filming examples, models, and things like that. So they would have someone, come in and they would film cats, I think, too, which is probably part of how, and probably the animators were cat owners, because I don't know anybody that's not a cat owner that would have gotten Figaro so right in so many places. Those little bitty, the way that his butt comes up when you're scratching.
Yes.
And stuff like that. So that, drawing from life, I think they started to really figure out there, probably because they were working on Bambi, and that's a lot of what they did with Bambi.
Right.
But I was interested in the fact that they didn't do any more rotoscoping, because it was so rough in Snow White, and they just didn't bother here. But I did find an interesting thing on the Wikipedia article where they said that the movements of Stromboli's caravan and then the coachman's coach were so hard for them to animate that what they actually did was they made maquettes, filmed them in stop motion animation, and then literally Xeroxed them onto the animated cells.
Right.
With like the earliest form of Xerox, which that was in a way sort of a similar technique. Those motions and those movements came out great. It worked really well. There wasn't a thing where I felt like it felt unnatural. None of that stood out.
Right. The very first thing I wrote down in my viewing notes when I was watching this was already better than Snow White.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you've got one of the first things that they actually animate. So instead of having our book opening with all of the reading, we have Jiminy actually just like come out and start talking to us, which when I wrote my notes, I was like, I don't know why I love Jiminy Cricket so much. Like, why do I have such warm memories of this cricket? He must have been the host of other things. And then I looked it up and he was. He hosted a whole bunch of their little like documentary shorts that, again, I watched when I was doing the Disney Channel as a youth.
Yes.
And so I was like, oh, this is why I love him and why I believe him. And just like trust him.
Right, yeah.
You know, we start out with him sort of telling us the story, but then one of the first actual animations we get is him seeing Geppetto's workshop and hopping towards it from his POV.
Right.
Where like you actually have the camera hop in the animation, which had to have been wild at the time.
Yes.
And would have been accomplished with, you know, they were perfecting this multiplane camera system and some systems for how the camera would move or the thing it was filming would move.
Right.
So that you could get those smooth motions, which is a thing that's like advanced quite a bit before CGI took over. But the multiplane camera is like one of my favorite things because what they just actually literally, they were like, how do we create depth in a drawing other than perspective tricks and the ways that people have been creating depth in art for years? But they're like, how do we do this?
Let's literally create depth.
Let's literally make depth.
Yes.
And they had these things that were these giant,
it's like a tower,
like 8-9 foot towers of glass plates so that your background was on the bottom and then a little bit up you would have like a little bit more and a little bit more so that you could actually have things feel like they were in the far back. And that were really close to you because they were far away or close to the camera itself.
Right.
And it's that whole thing I keep going on about remembering that this was a physical picture of a physical picture.
Right.
You know, we think of animation as this thing that sort of happens in this kind of almost nebulous way, but it was literally, they were filming these still shots the same way that they would film like a stop motion.
Exactly. Yes. We've been watching the Disney Insider series that's on Disney Plus, and it's to, you know, to kind of get some excitement for our upcoming Disney trip. And they have a bit about when they first used the multiplane camera, and they show little clips from Pinocchio, and you can see even like the old school animators who are still around and were in this show. And then some of the other people, they have like some little video clips of some of that. And they were so excited because they finally achieved natural looking movement. It's not, you know, I mean, and it was just like, bam. It's just, you know, they knew they were onto something.
When they're doing like the establishing shots as Pinocchio's about to go to school the next morning, there's a shot where they're sort of like going through the streets and then they go through like an archway down into a lower street. Like, so they go actually through this arch down into a lower street. And it's one of those things, first of all, at the time in 1938, 1939, when they were probably filming that, I don't know how hard that would be to do in live action, that shot.
Right.
Because of the size and shape of the cameras and how difficult they were to move. I don't know how easy it would have been for them to actually have achieved that in real life, let alone animated. And so, like, you see this shot as an adult in 2022, and it's just like, whoa.
Right.
Thinking of the fact that that was the first time they'd done that. That was the first time anybody had done that.
Yeah.
How amazing that was. And that they did it as part of, like, a lot of these tricks that they did were part of establishing shots. They were part of giving us a sense of where we were and when we were.
Yes.
Which, of course, is one of the reasons this is, in my opinion, a better movie than Snow White.
Yes. I have some thoughts about where and when we were, if you would like to discuss that real quick.
I would, actually. Because, I mean, the best I know is that the original book was Italian. And that's all I've got.
Yes. So the original book was Italian, and it was set in 19th century Tuscany. So Pinocchio is an Italian name. But the mountains in all of the backdrop stuff actually suggest an area called Trentino Alto and also the South Tyrolean region, which is actually a German-speaking region.
That explains some things.
Exactly. So, and that's where I'm going with it. So this region is in northern Italy, not Tuscany, and it is landlocked. So it's a little weird because they jump off a cliff into the ocean, and they're wearing lederhosen and buckled shoes.
Right. Their fashion is very German.
Yes. But I did not a deep dive, but I did a dive on lederhosen. So lederhosen were popular in 19th century Bavaria. Now, Bavaria does stretch down at that time, the region that we would call Bavaria now did stretch down into that South Tyrolean region in Italy and a little bit probably into Trentino Alto. So it is possible that in the 19th century, there were some Italian people who were really kind of German descent, and they were probably wearing lederhosen. Also, they got the lederhosen mostly correct. Men's were a little bit longer than boys. Theirs were shorter. However, boys would not have been embroidered. That would be an adult male thing. So they kind of fancied Pinocchio's lederhosen up a little bit. But we could say, well, Geppetto did that.
Geppetto was trying to make a very fancy puppet because clearly he made very fancy woodworking.
Exactly. And so, honestly, the lederhosen and the buckled shoes, they kind of fit, more or less. If you look at Jiminy Cricket, he's actually dressed pretty English. Mm-hmm. His tailcoat and the vest and, his top hat, certainly, those are decidedly English and some French, but more English. Like, that look is definitely a 19th century English look. So it's like, well, did he travel that far?
Who knows? Because Jiminy Cricket makes no sense. Exactly. I love him. Right. I love Jiminy Cricket so much for no reason. Right. But he makes no sense. Right. I mean, it's the quote from Wikipedia of like, Jiminy Cricket's a cricket because we told you he was a cricket. Yes. Yes.
And like a cricket, I did a little dive on crickets as well. I had to, but
this is like, I spent about an hour on the biology of sperm whales before I was like, I really need to stop.
Yes, I looked into sperm whales because we'll get to Monstro. I think he is the love child of a sperm whale and a blue whale.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And not accurate for either.
Yeah, it's terrible. But also, so we've got time and place, probably northern Italy. Don't know why there's an ocean there, but whatever.
Sure.
And then the music, though, is not Italian. And it's not even really German. Right. It's not either. There's some clear 19th century Tchaikovsky themed music. There are parts that sound a lot like Peter and the Wolf. There's a lot of that. And then there's some very American swing and jazz element when you're dealing with Honest John. So it is a patchwork. And the thing is, I don't mean to sound critical. This is just, it works in the movie, more or less.
Yeah, I think that the music in this, if we want to dive into the music a little bit, and again, this is me being one of those people that, like, I don't know music, but I know what I like. Mm-hmm. The music in this one really felt a lot like Disney had his composer and his lyricist and was just like, write me some tunes. Mm-hmm. Some of them did tie very much in to what was happening in the story at the time. I don't think they were trying as hard. Like Snow White, it felt like they were really trying to like actually advance the plot in the songs sometimes. Right. Not always, but sometimes. And in this one, I don't think that they were trying that hard for that.
Sometimes and sometimes not.
They were trying to give us the mood more than anything.
I mean, like, if you say an actor's life for me, he is singing to convince Pinocchio to, I want to go be an actor,
Right, that's the sell.
Right. Yeah. And then give a little whistle, same thing. But also, it's like, hey, this is an opportunity to put in a catchy song and it's going to hook people.
Right. Like, if you look at Give a Little Whistle, it makes no sense where it is.
Right.
It doesn't come back. I think I wrote that it's Chekhov's gun without the firing in the end.
Yep.
Because when he's trapped with Stromboli, he tries to whistle and he can't. And I'm like, no, but that whistle needs to come back somewhere. If you spent this entire time writing a song and singing a song about it, and it doesn't. But then at the same time, I'm not that mad because it's super catchy.
Right. Yes, exactly. And there is some really clever animation effects in that song.
Right.
He whistles into his hat and then the hat echoes it. And there are some cute things that Pinocchio does. I mean, it works. You don't have to, you don't have to totally buy in at that point. I mean, you can just enjoy it for what it is. It's a little musical diversion. And that's a common thing. Diversions exist everywhere.
Right.
In real life, we almost never break into song.
Yeah, but we almost always nowadays have a music player of some sort going somewhere.
Right. Yep.
people have their smart speakers and the meme of, Alexa play Despacito.
Right.
And all of that stuff. Like, we create a soundtrack to our lives in a way now.
Right.
And it probably was sort of similar then. Looking at this track list, When You Wish Upon a Star is a heavy story song in a way, but it's only sung at the very beginning and the very end to tell us what's about to happen or what just did happen.
Right.
And then you have Little Wooden Head, which is just, Geppetto having some fun. Give a Little Whistle, which, as we said, just Jiminy and Pinocchio having a little fun. Hi Diddle Dee Dee and its reprise, which are Honest John trying to fleece his mark.
Right.
And then I've Got No Strings.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, a musical number because it's a performance. But that's it, actually.
Yes.
There are far less songs in this. And the Hi Diddle Dee Dee reprise, which you only get a snippet of, really. There's very little of it. And that happens before they take him to Pleasure Island. And then there's no more music.
Right. And that actually, I think, ties into something that I read in your notes, was just like, hey, we got a plot. We've got a plot this time.
Things are happening.
Right. And, okay, so we can talk about this. I think you observed it, and you might say it better than I did, but we have a plot because it's based on a book, and they instead of basing it on kind of a loose interpretation of a fairy tale, this is based on a story that was actually serialized. And I have to hand it to Disney.
Yeah, when I started reading, like, some of the original stuff from the actual book, I was like, you know what? Because normally, like, Disney gets a lot of flack over the years for the changes they have made to sanitize or Disneyfy different fairy tales and different cultural stories. And that's, when they did that to actual, like, cultural stories like Mulan, I think that it's a very deserved criticism. But they get a lot of that. But in this case, I gotta say, I think they did it right.
Yeah. Doesn't Pinocchio kill Jiminy Cricket right off the bat?
Yeah.
Like,
he smashes him with a hammer. He's just like,
him.
Whatever. Stop trying to tell me what to do.
Yeah.
He starts abusing Geppetto as soon as he's carved in the original story.
Yeah.
Because he's a talking puppet before the Blue Fairy's magic in the original story.
Okay.
So, like, in the original story, Pinocchio is carved from a talking piece of wood.
Like you do.
Yeah, you find one of those, sure. And he's just a jerk.
Yeah.
From day one, he's a jerk.
Punk.
Geppetto's not all that sympathetic either, from what I read.
Right.
And Jiminy gets straight up murdered after he says, like, 2 things. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things where I really feel like Disney did a lot of work to make this into what it was. And I'm sure, especially if we have anybody that is going to listen to this that is Italian or Italian American that may have read the original book and it's a beloved children's story there, I am not knocking it at all on that front. I will give those people, like, absolutely, this movie is nothing like its book.
Right.
But one of my other rants, as somebody who has studied screenwriting, is that when you're doing an adaptation, the absolute worst thing you can do is a direct adaptation.
Right.
It's a bit like when you're actually trying to translate languages. Like, a direct translation is never actually going to be the best way to convey.
Exactly.
You have to look at, what does it mean? How does it feel? What is it trying to do?
Right.
And how can we do that?
Right.
I think that this movie actually, like, if you're trying to make a story that's about trying to teach a morality tale of how you need to be brave and selfless and true, and you need to care for others and listen to your conscience and sort of the lessons that are in there. I think this does it better than the original book would have.
Right.
If you had done a direct translation.
Yes, I think you're right about that. Also, to sing a few more praises from this movie, I said my very first notes was already better than Snow White. The music is better. The vocalization is less stylized and weird, especially on the part of the women.
Right.
The recording technology had clearly come a very long way. And I mean that in the vocal recording too. Well, specifically the vocal recording, I should say, because the balance between orchestra and voice is more where it should be. You can clearly understand all of the lyrics. Nobody sounds like a weird, sexy baby, like in Snow White.
Yeah, I never had any trouble understanding what the song was about or what was going on.
And the animation is, just like we've already said, miles better. And so it works.
And
better.
even the men singing, we talked about how Prince Charming was doing this weird, like, crooning thing that was very much of its time, but still sort of very much of its time.
Right.
I feel like Jiminy and When You Wish Upon a Star, there's a reason that has become Disney's signature tune.
Right.
And it's because he sings it in what feels like a much more timeless way.
Yes.
You don't need to have a cover. I mean, and it's been covered 3 gazillion times by now.
Right,
but you don't need to make a cover for audiences to be like, oh, let's modernize this a bit because people aren't going to want to listen to it. No, it's a very timeless ballad. And that's partially in the way he sings it.
Yes. And I mean, it's kind of I won't say it's the beginning. I did not do a deep dive on this, but he sings it in a way that is more familiar to the way now people expect kind of musical theater to sound. Like if you think of a Disney musical, it is not super stylized. It ain't Snow White. It's kind of what we've come to expect. And I couldn't tell you if it's the first instance of that or not.
Right.
It is worth examining like the timeline of, okay, this movie and early Disney animated musicals and Disney music in general. And then that whole line of musical theater and kind of where they parallel and where they diverge.
I think that, we were sort of talking about the songs that become iconic. And Snow White, you've got Hi-Ho, which everybody sort of knows. Hi-Ho, off to work I go. A lot of people will say something about Whistle While You Work.
Right.
There weren't songs that sort of weaved their way into the American cultural fabric, which When You Wish Upon a Star did, possibly because Disney makes it their signature tune to the point where their cruise ships actually play it when they blow their foghorns or whatever. Yeah. That's actually what their cruise ships play, is a few notes from that. So Disney has been partially responsible for that, but I think it would have anyway, because I've Got No Strings on Me, which is really a one-off in this. It's just a piece of, when we talk about it having a plot, it has a thread that runs all the way through of character development of Pinocchio learning to be brave and selfless and true, which actually I don't think is exactly what, I think that I'm pulling that phrasing from Once Upon a Time and not from this.
Right. I think it's
brave, truthful, and unselfish.
That's what it is.
Is what she tells him he needs to be. Yeah, so Brave, Selfless, and True is the name of a Once Upon a Time episode. I only watched 2 seasons of Once Upon a Time, but Geppetto is played by one of my favorite actors.
Oh, see, there you go.
Anyway, it's still an episodic movie.
Yep.
In a lot of ways. It is still a series of episodes in the life of this puppet that tie together through character development, which is, character development is always going to be the thing that I am going to like more than anything else. Fine, I'll make a chart of what actually literally happens in the movie. I don't need that chart to have all that much in it if I make a chart of how the character changes and I can see something there.
Right.
And Pinocchio himself and Jiminy change in this movie, and they learn a lesson, and they evolve. And so, like, the episodic nature of it, I'm not that upset. But anyway, that was a tangent to talk about I've Got No Strings on Me, which is kind of weird. Let's admit it. Like, that performance is strange. That's where we get the sexism.
Well,
the overt sexism.
Right.
But it is such a fun, catchy, and sticky, I think is the word that they use for like earworms and stuff. It's very sticky.
Yeah.
And it tells us a lot about Pinocchio and who he is and what he thinks. Even though, like, obviously Stromboli wrote this song. Somehow threw together this act in like an hour. Yeah.
He had those can puppets and stuff just laying around.
Yeah. It was like he just took what he had and he kind of adapted it really quick. I've watched enough of those, like, let's put on a show sort of stories that I'm like, okay, fine.
Right.
But it is telling you a lot about Pinocchio and who he is at that moment. What he wants and everything. But also, that song has become a cultural touchstone in an extreme. Like, I started looking up, like, the different ways because I remembered it was used in the Avengers Age of Ultron. They apparently did one of those dark emo covers of it for the trailer, which I'm so tired of. So it's in Avengers. It's apparently it's a through line in the CW DC shows, so it's with Captain Cold and everything, because it's this thing that, like, it's a cultural shorthand for no one is controlling me, I'm making my own decisions.
Right.
If you just say something like, I've got no strings, people they get it. They know. More than likely that song's going to start running through your head. That, to me, is such an achievement of songwriting, storytelling, everything else.
And if you think about it, that song is 80 years old now.
Yeah.
82.
Yeah, and it's not even like...
It's not a long song.
I bet kids love it in general. When You Wish Upon a Star is a song that adults are going to really attach to.
Right.
And kids might in the way that you attach to lullabies. I've Got No Strings is a song that kids are going to want to play on repeat and dance around to. Since we threw out a mention of the sexism.
Right.
There's only 2 women in this movie. And one of them is an overly flirtatious goldfish.
Right. I need to say one thing about this goldfish real quick.
Oh, yeah.
She has eyelashes.
I didn't even notice. Like, that's... Yeah. So as much as I love how much they got right with Figaro and how Figaro is very much a little more intelligent than most cats. I love cats. Cats are extremely intelligent.
Right.
Figaro is a little bit more anthropomorphized than the average cat, but Figaro acts like a cat.
Yep.
For the most part. Absolutely no other animal in this movie.
No. Yeah, it's bonkers.
Not one. And Geppetto is like the worst pet owner I've ever seen.
Oh, God, he's terrible. I mean, we can just go...
He at least loves them.
Yes.
I guess.
I wrote... So we can talk about Geppetto for just a minute. I wrote, Geppetto makes a lot of bad decisions. He is a downright reckless pet owner. And he smokes in bed, for starters.
Yeah.
He's smoking his pipe in bed. He just hangs the pipe up right by the bed.
He keeps a small blunderbuss under the pillow, sure.
Yep, like you do. Also, we can talk about his character in the whole scheme of the story. At the end, he's inside of a whale with his fish and his cat. And he says to Figaro, he says, I never thought it would end this way, Figaro. Well, who would, Geppetto? Right? Who would be like, yeah, I'm going to die. I see myself. Where do you see yourself in 30 years? I see myself dying inside of a whale with my cat and my goldfish. Nobody saw it.
Did you watch any of the deleted scenes?
No.
They're not worth it.
Okay.
They got deleted for a reason. But there is one where they were sort of changing the way that whole sequence went. Figaro decides to eat Cleo. And they make Figaro into a total asshole.
Yeah.
In the way that they do it, which is out of character for Figaro at this point.
Right.
Part of the reason I hate this scene. But I'm still sitting there, Geppetto, why did you bring a goldfish on a boat?
Right.
First of all. But also, you're standing there like, how weird is it to be fishing in front of your fish, talking about how you need fish to survive, to eat in front of your fish?
Yes. And... what are they feeding the fish?
Well, it's the fish that Monstro eats. So
no, I know, but so is she cannibalizing, or did they bring?
Oh no,
fish
you're
flakes?
right. What are they feeding Cleo? I thought about that too. I was like, how is Cleo not starving to death?
Yeah,
I think these animators have never had a pet goldfish.
I think they were cat owners and for sure not fish owners.
Well, and leaving aside that a goldfish of that size should be in a larger bowl.
Oh, 100%.
And not in a bowl at all because they need filtration and all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have fish.
I have had fish.
We did when I was growing up.
Yeah.
And so I know that is very much not a great way to keep fish.
Don't feed them cake.
But in the 1940s, don't feed them cake.
Right, don't do it.
It's just, Geppetto is such a terrible pet owner. He starts picking on Figaro, the second that Pinocchio is finished, as a puppet.
Yeah.
He starts picking on Figaro, and I'm just like, hey, jerk.
Yeah.
I realize you just made your own son because you're lonely or whatever, but this cat has already been with you. I mean, Figaro looks like a kitten, so less than a year, but
still.
This cat has still been taking care of you, opening windows for you.
Exactly. He opens the window for you, all that stuff.
Come on. Don't just suddenly abandon him because you have something human-shaped.
Exactly.
That's messed up.
Yeah, it is. But I will also say the cat up the back of the nightdress, been there. Well,
that's why I kept thinking, absolutely, these people have had cats. Because there were so many things where I was like,
Yep.
That's
been
what
there.
cats do.
Yep. So relatable.
That's how they are.
And one more thought from me about Geppetto. He's the only one other than Stromboli, and we're going to get to Stromboli.
Oh, God.
Who has an accent. He has a pretty
That's true.
weird accent, I might add.
Yeah, it's like what Americans think Italian accents sound like.
But little old man
But not even
Italians.
quite. It's a little Italian, a little German. Like I said, thinking of it as being Germanic actually makes a lot of things. Because there's an attraction at Disney World that's the Pinocchio Village House, Haus.
Mm-hmm.
That's German.
Right.
Geppetto is such an odd character in general. He's pretty flat, but he's a doting dad.
Mm-hmm.
A naive doting dad.
He's like a grandpa.
Yeah, I give him a lot of leeway, but possibly just because the rest of the story's going okay. To talk about the voice acting for a second. So we talked last time about how the voice actors were not credited.
Right.
And they were pretty much just whoever Disney could find that sounded pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
They were actors who had done other things, but it wasn't really much of a big deal. But this one, he was like, no, I've got money. I made a ton of money from Snow White. I've got money. I want my voice actors to actually be names that people have heard of. I want them to be actors who have been successful. I thought it was interesting that shift happened so fast because I was thinking, when we were talking about Snow White, I was thinking about the fact that by the time you get to the Renaissance and the golden age of Disney in the 90s that more people are familiar with, they were hiring celebrities.
Right.
That's their MO now, is that they get the celebrities. If you look at Encanto, and you look at that cast list, that is a powerhouse cast list.
Right. And Raya, they got Awkwafina.
Yeah, it's Kelly Tran and Awkwafina, and you're just like, okay. And they get these people who are very, very good actors. Now, I have some arguments I can make about the difference between being a good actor and being a good voice actor.
Sure.
But I do think Disney is good at hiring. I think that when you have the big name actors who do a bad job at voiceover work, it's because of bad directing and bad casting, which I don't think Disney does.
Right.
Disney has very few voice acting flops in their catalog.
Mm-hmm.
Very few.
Right.
So I think that that's impressive with this one, that they made that switch so fast.
Right.
It was their second movie, and they were like, we've got money, we're hiring the good guys.
And they did a good job of it.
Yeah. They did a great job. The voice acting in this is weird accents aside, the little kid that they intentionally, he was like, I'm not getting somebody putting on a little kid voice. I'm hiring a little kid to play Pinocchio, which is another thing Disney typically does. They usually get someone of generally the right age to play their child characters.
Right.
Works out great.
Yep.
These are all things that they established. I had no idea they established this early on.
Right.
Although, can we talk about the fact that the Blue Fairy is just Glinda the Good Witch, but blue?
Yes. And she's gigantic.
She is.
So, by modern fairy standards, she is a mountain. She is so, right. Because she's a full-size human being who happens, like you said, she's a witch.
They draw her as taller than Geppetto.
Yeah.
So she's what, 7 foot tall?
Yeah, she's 7 feet tall. She's beautiful. Also, I would like to say on her behalf, I am delighted that she sounds like a full-grown human being.
Right.
I can take the trade-off of her being terrifyingly huge if she were real. She would be scary as shit. She would be super scary. But she doesn't sound like a child. And so I'm like, all right, I'll take it. It's a trade-off I can live with.
I love the way they animated her. She did have a little bit of the flatness to her face that Snow White did.
Right.
I think that that's probably an artifact of a paint style or a literal type of paint because her face is pale.
Yeah.
Compared to a lot of the other characters. So I think that that's probably, maybe that tells us what happened with Snow White. It's not as flat as Snow White.
Right.
And she's translucent.
She's very ethereal. Yes.
Like you can actually see through her. I saw that and I was like, that is a nice touch.
Yep.
I don't know how they did it, just like if it was a lighting trick or if it was they literally just painted it lighter so that the light came through. There were a lot of little ways that they animated things. And apparently, with the money that he made from Snow White, Walt Disney started Disney Studios.
Right.
And he actually started looking at the people he was working with and saying, like, you are really good at this thing. Mm-hmm. Please do that thing all the time.
Right.
And so he had people who were just doing the water effects, who were just doing the blue fairy, who were just doing the cat.
Right.
Because it's what they were good at.
Yes.
I think it shows very much in this one because a lot of those effects really they're genius, the way that they came up with these things.
They're really, really good. And again, that's one of those leaps that they made between 1937 and 1940. Mm-hmm. It's a small step, a giant leap kind of situation.
Right.
Because it's like, for them, it was like, okay, this is what we've learned. We're going to put it into practice and bam. Mm-hmm. And so even though I will be honest, I do not like this movie because it will get there, but it's still more watchable than Snow White for me.
It's so much more watchable. Yeah. So, let's go ahead and talk about it. Stromboli, as I put it in my notes, Stromboli is racism cake with racism icing.
Yes. I wrote Stromboli is a problem.
Yeah. So go ahead and warn anybody that's listening. We are going to have to use a word that is a racial slur for the Romani people because it is used in the movie in order to discuss this. And I'm sorry about that. But the first thing that they say about Stromboli, after they show the poster that is already a caricature, is that old gypsy.
Yep, just right off the bat.
As soon as I was like, oh man, this is where we're going.
Yep.
Now, I have to acknowledge, I doubt there was anybody at Disney that had any sort of idea, although, let's be honest, Disney did lots of racist things in this era.
Oh, in this movie? Yeah.
Right, this movie.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking about all of their World War II propaganda shorts where...
Oh, yeah. Bad stuff.
The racism against Japanese people got real bad.
Yep.
So I'm not trying to give anybody a pass.
No.
At all.
No.
But I will say that word at the time did not have the connotations that it does now.
Correct.
Because of ignorance.
Correct. Let's talk about this content warning. Because you get a content warning at the beginning of this movie. It's for tobacco use.
Oh. Well, thank God.
Right.
Because...
Right. But... can we go into this?
But not for racism.
No, exactly. See, let's go into this a little bit. So the content warning is for tobacco use. There is also drinking.
Mm-hmm. Underage drinking.
Underage drinking.
Very underage drinking.
Yeah, like how old is Pinocchio? 7?
Yeah.
Maybe 6? I don't know.
Yeah.
There are racial slurs and a lot of awful racial stereotypes and depictions that don't get a warning. And not to mention... the GD kidnapping that happens.
Right.
None of that gets a content warning.
I feel like... So this is a thing that I found when I was looking into Stromboli. First of all, the character was not named Stromboli in the original book. That is an Italian joke.
Yeah.
So there you go. 1940s, Italian Americans were facing quite a bit of racial issues.
Right.
They were not considered... to be part of the white majority in America.
Right.
They were still stigmatized. So Stromboli's name, just that right there, is a racist joke.
Right.
But then people were talking about whether or not he's a Jewish caricature. I don't know. I am not that well versed in pulling apart those things. I thought that he was very clearly a stereotype of Romani people.
I think he could be all of the above. I think they lumped it all into like not waspy white people.
Right. He became this,
he is.
Let's make a not white bad guy.
Yeah.
And it was just this pile of stereotypes. His lips and his nose and like,
his hair. The way he moves. Yeah.
The way that he slips into a language that I do not think is Italian when he's angry. And he just starts ranting in some sort of not English. It didn't feel like it was an actual language to me when he was doing it. I could stand corrected if someone speaks Italian and wants to tell me. And he's got the caravan. He's got the show where he's trying to trick people into giving him gold.
Yeah.
And he's greedy and keeping all of it. Although one thing that I read that actually kind of cracked me up. And I know this is one of those things that Wikipedia, anybody can write on Wikipedia. It's not necessarily a quote from someone who has any kind of like
expertise.
Background. Right. But somebody said something about how Stromboli was one of the earliest examples of Disney creating a villain whose motivations weren't clear from the beginning and who seems fine at first until they have their like heel turn and they reveal that they're a bad guy. And I'm like, what movie were you watching? Stromboli was a bad guy from the second the poster showed up.
Yep.
Like, the poster was coded bad guy. The way Honest John talked about him, bad guy. The way he looks while they're performing when Pinocchio first falls down, bad guy. Right. The way he's counting his money with a sword.
He locks Pinocchio in a bird cage. Like,
yeah.
He throws an axe into the woodpile, which has an old puppet
Oh my gosh.
in it. Hello.
That is, yeah, like,
that is
as soon
scary.
as he does that, I was like, this is where this movie gets real dark.
Yes.
And that's actually mild compared to things that happen later.
Yes.
Yeah, he chops, like, we've got, sure, we sort of understand as adults that Pinocchio is a special puppet. He's different. He's been given life by the Blue Fairy.
Right.
The other puppets are just puppets, whatever. But when you're a kid, you're already infusing everything around you with an internal life.
Yes.
You're already anthropomorphizing all of your toys.
Yeah, all of it.
You've probably read The Velveteen Rabbit at this point.
Yeah.
Good Lord, if you've watched The Brave Little Toaster, you're already ruined.
Yeah.
This scene where Stromboli chucks that axe into that puppet may as well be murder to a small child.
Yes. It is super dark. And then Pinocchio asks Jiminy Cricket, he's like, you mean you can't open it? When Jiminy Cricket has tried to pick the lock. He is a cricket.
Right?
No, he can. It's a
like,
miracle.
You're lucky he's not dead.
I know. It's a miracle he can talk. He is wearing a top hat and tails and carrying a little tiny umbrella.
The fact that he has spats is already strange.
Yes. He's like, no, he cannot open the padlock. Pinocchio, stop it. Anyway, so yes, Stromboli is a big racist problem.
Stromboli is so... And this is... I wrote at one point that the villains in this movie are excellent villains.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is... After seeing how great the evil queen was in Snow White and then watching these... I see why Disney Villains is its own brand.
Yep.
Stromboli, racist character, absolutely. But also freaking terrifying.
Yeah, very scary.
And the fact that you have this situation where Pinocchio was tricked, but willingly walked into this, thinking that the situation was one thing, and then suddenly it's another. And that there's this adult who does not have his best interests in mind. The fact that they made a movie where you have a small child where the villains are all adults.
Right. Let's talk about this whole scene. Like, yeah, small child, villains are adults. And he has kind of made Pinocchio feel like he's complicit in the crime because the way that he goes along with Honest John, and then the Blue Fairy comes down and she saves the day. It's handy. She lets them out, and Pinocchio tells a lie. Well, we can talk about the nose thing now. All of this stuff, because she's like, well, what happened? And he immediately fabricates this massive lie. And it's like, well, what on earth? And when you think about it, that is a natural thing that kids would do. It's also a natural thing that kids have been manipulated would do because they are afraid of what happens if they tell the truth. So
yeah, I had some problems with that scene. First of all, because of the fact that I didn't realize this is the only time his nose grows in the entire movie.
Yep. And yet that's the thing we think about.
It's become like the thing you know about Pinocchio. But also, it's not been set up in any way for you to understand, oh, his nose is growing because he's lying. They've said he needs to be truthful.
Right.
But
that's a weird tell.
It's an odd thing to suddenly have happen.
Yeah. Also, there's a bird's nest that shows up.
Right. And like it just keeps going.
Yeah.
But the thing that gets me is that like you can tell And this is credit to the voice actress, but the voice actress who's doing the Blue Fairy, the way that she goes, and then what happened?
Yes.
She knows. She doesn't believe a word of it. How many times have I seen this interaction between a 7-year-old and a parent where it's like, what happened to your homework? Well, this kid at school, they did the thing, and then this... Kids make up these wild stories because they just do.
Right.
Like, it's just a developmental stage.
It is, yes. And so it doesn't have to be this big, terrible thing, you know?
Right.
Yes.
I understand, and I kind of like the lesson of lies grow and grow until they're out of control.
Yes.
I think that that's a good lesson. But then a minute later, she says, if a boy isn't good, he may as well be made of wood. Right. And I'm just like, oh, you took that too far.
Right.
Too far.
Right. Yeah. Because then, honestly, if we can go way too far with this thought train that we're on, when you start saying stuff like that, then it makes kids feel like they can't afford a single mistake. There is no soft place to land. Now, again, I don't think any kid is going to carry the lessons from Pinocchio and be like, oh my God, if I'm not good, I might as well be made of wood. And I don't think it's going to go that far in real life. But like, that is kind of like, it's just like, nope, you can't afford to mess up even once.
It's a piece of a larger cultural puzzle, though, I think.
Yes.
Because one of the other things I identified is when Pinocchio first goes off with Honest John the first time to go be an actor, and Gemini is like, I'll go tell his father. No, that would be snitching. Yeah. And I'm like, go snitch!
Yes, do it!
Snitch, Gemini!
Yes.
This is a case because we have so much media for children that talks to them about don't be a tattletale, don't be a snitch, don't tell on people. And I'm like, yes, tell on people.
Yeah, there is a time where this matters.
There are cases where you absolutely should go get a grown-up.
Yes, yes. This is one.
This kid is running off with a dishonest fox to become an actor God knows where instead of going to school. Is a moment where you go get a grown-up.
Yep.
And I don't think there's anybody in the world that the only thing they ever watched was Pinocchio, and they were like, oh, I can't snitch because Jiminy said don't snitch.
Right.
I think it's just that it's a piece of a larger cultural pattern. And I think that whole thing of, oh, Pinocchio, you can't tell any lies.
Right.
You have to be good. You have to be completely truthful. Is a piece of this larger cultural fabric that does get used by manipulators, by Stromboli.
Exactly.
To keep kids from telling, because they're like, oh, well, nobody will believe you.
Exactly.
And if you're telling the truth, you have to say that you came here willingly.
Yeah. And there's that. And also, there are times when you should lie. If somebody is asking you to do something and you know you shouldn't, blah, 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 lie and run like hell.
If an old lady comes to your house and says, are you here alone, Snow White?
Lie.
You should say, no. No, I am not.
Right.
Revisiting the Vault is a 9-hour films production, and it's edited by Mary Ratliff. Our music is by Music Motion and Lynn Publishing. We are not affiliated with or authorized by the Walt Disney Company. You can find us on Twitter at Revisit the Vault, and you can find our website at revisitingthevault.com. If you want to support us, the best thing that you can do is to tell other people about the show and make sure you leave a review in whatever app you're using to listen. We do also have a Patreon, and I want to do a special shout out to my friend Michael, who became our first patron when we launched. He has been supporting my creative projects for over 20 years now, and it really means a lot, so a big, big thank you to him. If you want to join him and our other patrons, you can get access to rewards like outtakes and deleted scenes from each of our episodes, a handwritten note card from one of us, stickers, and other fun stuff. So go check that out at patreon.com/9hourfilms. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you in 2 weeks for the second half of our discussion on Pinocchio. But for now, here's a quick sneak peek. Not that his economic plan makes any sense at all.
No, yeah, let's talk about Pleasure Island. My first notes about Pleasure Island were Pleasure Island is a circus nightmare.